The forest doesn't hum, it listens. You step carefully over a mossy root boot, sinking softly into damp earth, and pause. Overhead, eucalyptus trees lean into the night like old eavesdroppers, their silvery leaves shivering in the faintest breeze. The Tasmanian bush is darker than it should be, darker than memory even allows, and it muffles sound the way fog softens light. You don't know what you're searching for, yet only that something was once here. Something quiet, something striped. You tilt your head, and in that perfect silence, no cicadas, no birds, no wind, your ears play tricks. Did you just hear a pad, a sniff, a sigh? No dog could move so lightly, and no kangaroo either. But the prints in the mud tell a story: narrow toes, long heel, an awkward, almost human step. You kneel, touch the print. Still fresh and possible. Still warm, but it feels that way because you want it to be. A part of you imagines glowing yellow eyes beyond brush, a long, stiff tail twitching once, but nothing moves. Still, you keep looking. You see the thylacine, also called the Tasmanian tiger, though it's neither tiger nor Tasmanian by birth, wasn't supposed to survive this long. And by all official records, it hasn't. The last one, a male named Benjamin, died in 1936 in a concrete zoo enclosure. He curled up and didn't wake up again. But the bushland doesn't respect paperwork. It keeps secrets in roots and wind, and maybe a heartbeat deeper in the underbrush. Historians still argue whether sightings reported decades later are fabrications, folklore, or just misplaced hope. But you're not here to argue. You're here to walk where it walked, to breathe where it howled. The trees part slightly ahead, revealing a faint trail, barely a path more, a memory of one. You step forward, and then you freeze. Not from fear, but from the strange, almost electric tingle of being watched. This is the first of many moments you'll feel it tonight, the uncanny sensation of eyes that don't blink, just witness. The thylacine, if it were still alive, would not charge or snarl. It would stand briefly perfectly still, like an echo that hasn't decided whether to return. You'd see its head wide like a dog's jaws, stretched too far for comfort, with ears twitching independently, like satellite dishes from a sci-fi rerun. Its back would arch gently sloping into a long tail that seems too heavy for its own frame. But those stripes, 13 to 20 in count, look painted on by a bored surrealist. Some say the stripes helped it blend into grasslands. Others think they made it easier for parents to identify each other while hunting. Or maybe they were just for show. Historians still debate that too. You breathe deep. The air smells of damp lichen and history. If nostalgia had a scent, it might live here somewhere between old bark and phantom fur. The trees thicken again, closing behind you like a curtain. The path narrows to almost nothing, but you follow. Because now you have to. Somewhere far off, an owl calls, but it sounds too low, too deliberate. And then you realize it isn't an owl. It's a cough, or maybe a yawn. The thylacine's call was never a roar. It didn't match its fearsome looks. Early reports said it made a husky bark or a hollow cough, but others claimed it let out a strange, breathy howl at night, something between a sigh and a whistle. One 19th century farmer described it as like someone giving up. Charming. As you walk deeper, the forest begins to hum after all, though it's just the blood in your ears and the whisper of imagination. You begin to feel like you're being followed, but only by the past. You think of early explorers like George Harris, who first described the creature in 1808 and was baffled to find a carnivorous marsupial, a meat-eater with a pouch. What next, egg-laying mammals? Wait, those exist too. Australia is that kind of place. You smile, if only to yourself, then trip on a branch. That's the forest's way of humbling you when you start feeling clever. At the edge of a small creek, you stop and sit on a damp log. The stars above flicker between swaying branches. You look around, not to spot something, but to feel it. You think about how some old reports claimed the thylacine would sometimes follow humans from a distance, silently, watching, never attacking, just observing like it couldn't decide if you were prey or performance art. A branch cracks behind you. You spin. Nothing. But maybe that's enough for tonight. You close your eyes for a moment too long and dream of stripes in the fog. You wake to dew gathering on your boots and a damp ache settling into your spine. The log you slept on wasn't kind, but it feels earned. The forest around you is a little brighter now, just enough to blur the night's illusions without banishing them entirely. You squint into the tree line, hoping the shapes resolve into something more cooperative. They don't. Still you rise, you keep walking. Because you're not just chasing a ghost, you're chasing its coat. The thylacine stripes are its signature. Stripes that shouldn't exist. Not on a marsupial. Not in this evolutionary neighborhood. Not across that lean, lanky back where golden brown fur meets inky black slashes. 13 to 20 stripes, each slightly different, like a barcode, nature didn't finish scanning. You can't help but imagine them painted by a bored child with one too many crayons and too few anatomical textbooks. The word tiger is a misdirection, of course. There's nothing feline about the thylacine's movements, no pounce, no slink. It ambled, it loped, it sort of plodded through the underbrush like a distant cousin of the wolf who got tired halfway through evolution and said, "This'll do." But the stripes gave it away, even when it didn't want to be found. Early European settlers described it as a hybrid nightmare, the body of a wolf, the tail of a kangaroo, the jaw of a cartoon villain. It had that unsettling look of an animal, misassembled from memory. If nature were a builder, it forgot the instruction manual halfway through and just winged it. But nature had its reasons. Historians still debate why such an odd combination of features evolved in the first place. Was it camouflage for forest or grassland? A visual trick to confuse predators? A warning, or was it something subtler, an evolutionary whimsy that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with aesthetic weirdness? You trace your finger along a nearby tree trunk, dragging it through peeling bark that flakes like sunburned skin. You imagine the thylacine brushing against the same tree a century ago, stripes blending with the dappled light vanishing before the human eye could lock focus. Some researchers argue the thylacine may have hunted at dusk and dawn, those liminal hours where light is neither friend nor foe. In that half-light, its stripes would have done their job well, breaking up its shape, dissolving it into background. The predator becomes suggestion, and the prey hesitation is all it takes. You look down at your reflection in a puddle. The water trembles from some distant sound, probably a bird, or your imagination, or both. You wonder what the thylacine saw in its own reflection, if anything. Did it recognize itself, or just the forest looking back? In 1805, artist John Lewin sketched what is now one of the earliest visual records of the animal. He got the stripes mostly right. The legs, not so much. It looked more like a dachshund that moonlighted as a zebra. But that's what happens when you draw from hearsay. Even then, the thylacine was half fact, half fiction. You reach a low ridge, the kind the animal might have used to survey territory. It wasn't fast, certainly not compared to wolves or big cats, but it was persistent. A plodder, a skulker, a being that trusted its environment more than its speed. You admire that. There's something noble about moving through the world with quiet certainty, even if the world doesn't understand you. Modern taxidermy exhibits have tried to preserve its image. Some get the stripes wrong, others the posture. A few unfortunate museum specimens look like someone inflated a taxidermied fox with a bicycle pump. You've seen one, haven't you? Glass-eyed, stiff-legged, mouth agape in a permanent snarl that never quite belonged to the living version. It's sad, but it's also the only version we have. Unless it isn't. Because there's always the rumor, always the story passed from hiker to ranger to newspaper. A blurry photo, a fleeting glance, a shadow too purposeful. I saw it, someone whispers. It looked back at me. You shake your head. Not because you disbelieve, but because you want to believe, and that's dangerous territory for any amateur historian. Hope is a slippery lens. Still, something in the way the stripes flicker across your mind tells you not to rule it out entirely. You sit again on a rock, warmed faintly by the sun. You pull out a field notebook. You sketch, not well, but with intent. You mark where the tail would fall, how the stripes might curve across the flanks. You try to picture the eyes, not fierce, but curious. Sad even. A predator with the soul of a ghost. As you close the notebook, a breeze carries leaves past your boots. They swirl briefly in a circular gust, then fall flat again, like something was here and left. You stand and walk on. You hear it before you see it. A strange rustling ahead, not quite urgent enough to be danger, but not casual either. Maybe a wallaby bounding off. Maybe your stomach, which you forgot to feed since yesterday. But no, this sound is more methodical. Brush pushed aside, a slow, deliberate shuffling like something dragging itself forward by memory. You crouch low behind a fallen log. You peer through bracken that parts just enough to frame the thought in your head. What if? But nothing moves. Nothing appears. That's the thylacine's legacy, really always almost there. You rise again and follow the rustling, even if it's probably just a bird with dramatic flair. The path narrows into a tunnel of wattles, golden blooms glowing faintly in early light. You walk slower here. This part feels sacred. And then you imagine the strangest thing, a pouch. Not on a mother, but on a father. You blink. Marsupials always have pouches, sure. But the thylacine's anatomy raised eyebrows and questions, especially when some accounts, still debated by scholars, suggested the males had a backward opening pouch as well. Like a secret satchel, stitched just above the groin. Its purpose likely to protect the delicate bits during rough hunts through thorny brush. Evolution can be weirdly considerate. You pause at a clearing. The sun finds you now painting light across a small pond where dragonflies hover like thoughts you forgot to think. This might have been a watering hole once. You kneel, brush aside leaves. Here the thylacine might have drunk, might have brought her cubs. The babies were called joeys, just like kangaroos and possums. Born the size of a peanut, they'd crawl blindly into the pouch and latch onto a nipple. There they'd stay for months, growing hidden alive. Some Aboriginal stories speak of a spirit dog that carried stars in its belly, a creature with a bark like wind and a gaze like dusk. It was protector and predator both. Some say that was the thylacine. Others say it was myth, layered over memory softened by time. Historians still argue whether the Corinna, the striped dog described in oral tradition, was the thylacine or another animal entirely now lost. You close your eyes. The pond trickles. Somewhere something chirps, but not a bird you recognize. The thylacine's gait was awkward, its back legs longer than the front, its tail stiff and unbending. It couldn't wag, not joyfully at least. Instead, it thudded side to side as the animal moved more like a rudder than an appendage. And when it ran, it bounded. Some said it moved like a kangaroo, leaping awkwardly, almost comically. Others swore it loped like a slow-motion dog. In captivity, it paced, back and forth, again and again, as if trying to remember what soil under the paw was supposed to feel like. You imagine one of them now pacing behind a cage wall, eyes dulled by lantern light. A pouch still full, maybe. A mother hollow with instinct and no outlet. In 1910, a photographer captured a brief moment of such pacing, a blurry loop of motion that now flickers through documentaries and memory like a ghost trying to reenact its own funeral. You've probably seen it before, the flick of stripes, the curl of spine, the tail dragging behind like a question mark. You wonder what it would have smelled like. Musky, maybe, like all wild things. A hint of wet fur and meat. The kind of scent you'd forget the moment it vanished, but never quite stop looking for. And its bite. Surprising. The thylacine's jaw could open to nearly 80 degrees wider than most big cats. Early zoologists measured the gape and recoiled. It could unhinge its mouth like a snake, revealing a yawning pink cave of tiny teeth. Terrifying to look at, but probably not as deadly as you'd think. The bite force was relatively weak, more show than slaughter. The creature didn't need brute force. It needed patience, stealth, that slow approach through shadow and grass, that ghostly drift between the trees, that pause, always the pause before the pounce. You walk again the pond behind you now, the clearing fading into a blur of trees. Your path narrows to a wombat track barely wide enough for your boots. You duck under low branches, let leaves rake across your shoulders like soft claws. You feel your breath slow. Something shifts in you, not fear, something quieter, reverence. You stop again instinctively, and you whisper, "Where did you go?" The forest doesn't answer. But the silence is the kind that respects your question. You follow a ridgeline, now the trees thinning out just enough to show you sky a grayish blue, with hints of blush near the horizon, as if the morning itself is embarrassed to be awake. Below, the bushland stretches in folds and shadows stitched together by memory and mist. This is where stories live. Not in books, in the soil, in the air that smells like smoke and eucalyptus. You stop by a cluster of flat stones, naturally arranged but looking suspiciously ceremonial. It's here you remember the oldest stories, not from textbooks, from mouths. The first peoples of Tasmania walked this land long before empires fell, before ships brought sheep and worry, before names like thylacine ever formed on paper. To them, this creature had a different place in the world. It wasn't villain or vermin. It was kin, a shadowed sibling in the great balance. They called it Corinna, sometimes protector, sometimes teacher, occasionally nuisance, but rarely monster. You sit on one of the stones and imagine what it would have been like to hear those stories by firelight, the smell of ash and charred wallaby meat filling the air. A child asking, "Did you see one?" And a grandmother replying, "Not me, but your uncle did." It followed him all the way home. Was it real or allegory? Historians still argue whether these oral traditions referenced the thylacine or another now extinct predator, perhaps a mainland relative or a spirit being dressed in stripes for effect. But you suspect the distinction didn't matter to those telling the tale. They weren't cataloging species. They were speaking truths that science struggles to translate. You run your hand across the cool stone. There's lichen growing in perfect spirals. Nature's quiet graffiti. Aboriginal rock art in parts of Australia on the mainland mostly depicts dog-like creatures with stripe marks, Though no confirmed Tasmanian thylacine art survives the implication whispers across time, we knew them before you did. European settlers, of course, weren't listening. When the British colonized Tasmania in the early 1800s, they brought with them livestock fences, shotguns, and fear. The thylacine rare even then became a scapegoat almost immediately. Sheep went missing. Chickens disappeared. And suddenly every dark shape in the night was the tiger. It didn't matter that feral dogs roamed freely, or that human carelessness explained most losses. No. It was easier to point at the striped thing in the woods. It looked strange. It didn't belong to them, so they blamed it. Still, those old stories lingered. Some Aboriginal legends described the Corinna as a guide to the afterlife. Others said it warned travelers of danger. And one tale, your favorite, says it howled at night, not out of hunger, but to mourn stars that fell from the sky. You like that version best? A lament. You stand again and follow a track worn into the earth, not by humans, but perhaps by wallabies or wombats, or maybe just once a thylacine family, padding through the undergrowth. The mother in front, her pouch heavy. The father behind, silent, protective. If it had a name for itself, you'll never know it. But Corinna is close enough. The forest grows denser, the sun higher, but you still walk in half-light. It's the kind of illumination that invites reflection, not action. You think again about how the thylacine might have seen the world, not through eyes of judgment, but calculation, movement, pattern, sound. It wasn't a roar hunter like lions. It didn't ambush from trees like leopards. It tracked, waited, watched, sometimes followed prey for hours, even days. And in that watching, maybe it watched us too. You chuckle quietly. A modern camper might describe the feeling of being followed in the woods, something low to the ground just behind them. A breath they can't place, a sound they can't mimic. They think ghost, but maybe it's just memory. You pause on a mossy incline, catching your breath. The air smells old here, sweet decay and rain-soaked bark. And then you hear it again. Not a howl, a yawn. That strange raspy exhale you read about in a footnote once. The thylacine didn't bark so much as exhale pointedly. A chuff, a sigh. Like someone who had something to say but decided it wasn't worth the trouble. You stay perfectly still. You want to believe you do. But the forest holds its silence again. You smile. Of course it does. It always does. There's something about colonial fear that ages poorly. You've read the journals, the letters home, the scrawled ink across yellowing pages from men in boots who had never heard the word ecosystem, but knew the sound of a sheep crying in the night. And so they turned to the nearest strange thing with teeth. The thylacine. You push through another thicket, a eucalyptus branch snagging at your sleeve like a curious hand. The forest doesn't resist your presence. It simply evaluates you like the thylacine might have. Watching, listening, deciding. In the early 1800s, those first European settlers didn't know what they were looking at. They called it a tiger, though it didn't pounce. A hyena, though it didn't laugh. A wolf, though it came from a lineage entirely divorced from canines. It was a marsupial, not a placental mammal, which, to be fair, isn't something your average sheep farmer was pondering as he loaded his musket. The settlers' minds folded the animal into what they knew, and what they knew were monsters. You come to a clearing littered with shards of old fencing, rusted posts, forgotten wire, weather-warped timbers. This could have been a holding pen once, or a trap. You imagine the early efforts, scared men building barriers against an enemy they didn't understand, didn't care to understand. You crouch by the edge of a broken post. A nail is still embedded in the wood, angled awkwardly, as if driven with too much panic and not enough precision. You picture the settlers sweating, muttering, convinced the striped shadow would come in the night and carry off his livelihood. But the data didn't support that, not really. Historians still argue whether the thylacine was even responsible for most of the livestock deaths it was blamed for. Modern analysis of jaw strength, tooth shape, and hunting behavior suggests it might have been physically incapable of taking down a healthy adult sheep. At best, it could have snatched a lamb. More likely, the true culprits were feral dogs introduced by colonists, or even the colonists themselves, covering up sloppy animal husbandry with fear-fueled scapegoating. Yet the narrative stuck. Governments issued bounties, 1 pound per adult, 10 shillings per pup. It was enough to get attention, enough to mobilize desperation. And so the hunt began. You walk again, heading toward a shallow dip in the land where ferns grow thicker. The air here is cooler, wetter. You can almost hear the echo of musket fire in the distance, even though the trees have long since grown over that era. Some bounty hunters took it seriously. Others just took advantage. There are stories of people submitting fox pelts, or even died dogs claiming rewards. The administrators weren't always experts, and desperation has a way of making people creative. You pause beside a rock wall that juts out from the hillside like a jagged tooth. Carved into it, faint, almost erased by moss, you notice letters. Possibly initials, possibly nonsense. Someone was here, maybe waiting, maybe hoping to lure the thylacine with meat or scent or silence. You wonder if it worked. You wonder if anyone ever looked into those round, golden brown eyes and hesitated. There's one account from 1852 where a farmer reportedly caught a female thylacine in a trap. She didn't fight. She simply stared at him, her body curled around her pouch. When he approached, she let out that breathy cough yawn. He claimed it sounded like grief. You're not sure how much of that is true, or if it matters. Because even if he embellished the sound, the image lingers. A wild thing misunderstood, wrapped around her children, staring at her destroyer with something more human than rage. You reach another ridge and stop for a drink. The water tastes like metal and leaves, and you kind of like it. It reminds you of stories told too late. You sit for a while, shoes dangling over the edge. The view is spectacular. Rolling hills in shadow dots of white gum trees catching sunlight like mirror shards. And somewhere in the unseen valleys, the last thylacines once ran. It's strange to think that extinction isn't a moment. It's a long, slow unraveling. An animal doesn't vanish when the last one dies. It vanishes in the silence after, when people stop speaking its name, when maps are redrawn, when the sounds it made are imitated badly by actors in nature documentaries. You say its name now aloud, thylacine? It doesn't echo, but that's okay. You're not here for echo. You're here for presence, even if it's just imagined. You close your eyes and let the wind graze your face. If you listen hard enough, you can almost hear the clumsy rustle of stiff legs, the soft crush of grass beneath a padded paw, the faintest breath escaping from a creature that never barked, never growled, but still somehow howled. You follow the ridge as it dissolves into gentler hills, the forest, folding itself inward like a page being turned. Trees huddle closer here, their trunks moss-wrapped and leaning slightly as if listening. The light is soft and indirect, like it's sneaking in. Everything around you feels like it's holding its breath, which is fitting. Because this is the part of the story where people started aiming guns at shadows. It began as it so often does, with panic. You imagine the early settler families in their clapboard homes, sheep fenced in, chickens clucking just out of view, and always a flicker at the tree line. A shape they didn't recognize. A posture too fluid to be a dog, too low to be a kangaroo, too quiet to be harmless. One sheep goes missing, then two. Maybe they wandered. Maybe they were stolen. But fear doesn't wait for evidence. Fear fills the blanks with teeth. You reach a wooden sign nailed to a rotting post. The letters are barely visible, now carved deep but worn down. No trespassing. Private hunting reserve. 1921. The irony makes you smirk. You've trespassed into a memory. The colonial government began issuing bounties in 1830, a tidy sum for each adult thylacine brought in. The equivalent of a few weeks' wages. Enough to motivate. From there, the numbers fell. Hunters came with traps, dogs' poison, and paranoia. They killed indiscriminately sometimes, bagging Tasmanian devils or wombats in the frenzy. If it moved at night, if it had fur, if it didn't look like something they'd brought with them from Britain, it was fair game. You pass a half-collapsed wooden structure, barely a shed, its roof now part of the forest floor. A hunter's post, maybe, or a shelter for checking traps. You step inside gently. The air smells of rust and old nails. On a shelf, miraculously intact, lies a rusted steel jaw trap. You don't touch it. You don't need to. It speaks well enough for itself. The thylacine's demise wasn't just about misunderstanding, it was about acceleration. Its population was already dwindling by the time colonists arrived. Habitat fragmentation disease and competition from introduced species had weakened its hold. The bounties were a match thrown into a dry forest. By the early 1900s, the creature was already rare. Sightings became stories, stories became rumors, and rumors became regrets. You sit on the sagging threshold of the shed and think about how easily myths form not from fiction, but from the silence left after something is gone. One hunter, whose name is lost to history, reportedly killed 5 thylacines in a single week. His journal entry simply reads, "No more seen." You wonder if he knew what he'd done, or if the payday dulled the echo. You stand and walk on. Your feet follow a creek bed, now mostly dry except for a few shallow pools where frogs lurk and dragonflies dart. This could have been a place of life once. Water always draws the living closer. You pause at a print in the mud. Not fresh, not real. Just the outline of a stone shaped like a paw, and your mind too eager to believe. You laugh gently. Foolishness is part of the process. Then you remember a clipping, a 1923 article from The Mercury, a local paper describing a large striped beast seen circling a farmhouse. The farmer reported no damage, no missing livestock, just the eyes, watching. You look behind you, half joking. No eyes, just trees. The bounties ended too late. By the time public sentiment began to shift, by the time a few voices in the scientific community started calling for preservation, it was over. The last confirmed kill in the wild was around 1930, the last capture in 1933. After that, it was down to one, a male misnamed Benjamin, because nobody knew or checked his sex until long after he died. He lived in Hobart Zoo. You've seen the footage, grainy, black and white, heartbreaking. He paces, he yawns, he looks bored. No trees, no prey, no pack, just concrete and camera shutters. And then in 1936, they left him outside overnight. A cold snap hit. No shelter. He curled up. He didn't wake. The species was declared extinct decades later with all the ceremony of a late arriving apology. You step over the creek and pause to listen, not to the water, to the silence it carries, because sometimes absence sounds like something too. You climb. The incline is shallow at first, just enough to make your thighs complain gently, but then the land lifts harder, like it's trying to remind you who's in charge. Stones shift beneath your boots. The path becomes less a trail and more a suggestion. You duck under a fallen log slick with lichen, and emerge into a clearing that feels older than time. And there it is, a newspaper clipping nailed to a corkboard in your memory. You didn't bring it. You don't need to. You've seen it so many times you can quote it. Tiger strikes again. Livestock killer eludes capture. Launceston Examiner, 1928. You imagine the bold headline, the breathless copy, the shaky photograph of a farmer pointing at nothing. A hole in a fence, a smear of wool, maybe a few tooth marks, but never the actual culprit. You sit on a stump and watch the clearing like it's a stage. This was the theater of blame, the place where imagination stood in for evidence. The thylacine, by now rare reclusive, maybe even functionally gone, was cast as the villain in every agricultural melodrama. You exhale slowly. You're not mad at them exactly. You understand fear. And you understand how quickly it wants to tell a story. But it's funny, isn't it? For an animal so rarely seen, the thylacine sure got around in the headlines. You remember one from 1911 where a man swore the animal had broken into his chicken coop, killed 14 hens, and arranged them in a line like a warning. Sounds like more of a fox move or a human one, frankly. But the thylacine took the blame. Historians still argue whether these attacks were real, embellished, or completely fabricated. Many point to feral dogs. Some suspect exaggeration for bounty money, and always a few, suggest the animal was scapegoated simply because it looked too strange to trust. You trace your finger through the dirt at your feet, a crude line of stripes. You imagine a thylacine watching a farmhouse from the tree line, not with malice, but with curiosity. Maybe hunger, yes, but more likely confusion. This wasn't its world anymore. The forest was shrinking. The plains were fenced. The things that moved in the night now wore shoes and carried lanterns and shouted in a language it never learned to fear. You walk to the far edge of the clearing where a half-fallen stone chimney rises from the undergrowth. A house once stood here. You touch the stones, feel their warmth from the morning sun. This could have been the home of someone who sent in a bounty claim, or someone who wrote to the paper with a trembling story of eyes in the dark. Sensationalism sold papers. The more dramatic the story, the more likely it would run. Tiger attacks, big letters, bigger fear, but always light on details. One famous hoax claimed a thylacine had attacked a schoolhouse. Later investigation showed it was a dog, possibly a sheepdog, possibly the teacher's own. But retractions rarely make the front page. You follow a new trail barely visible. Ferns brush your calves. A bird you can't name watches you from a crooked limb, feathers puffed like it's trying to look important. The thylacine, you realize, was rarely seen by day. Most confirmed observations happened at dawn or dusk. Its eyes, large and forward-facing, were built for low light. Its body for quiet pursuit. It didn't rush. It flowed. You stop beside a ring of stones, blackened from long, cooled fire. A campsite. Old, possibly recent, possibly decades gone. You wonder who sat here. A hunter, a hiker, a scientist hoping for a glimpse. You sit too, and for a moment you pretend. You imagine being the last thylacine in the wild, alone, unmated, wandering. You sniff at unfamiliar smells, dodge fences, hear noises that make no sense, cars' radios, human voices arguing about dinner. You howl your thin, reedy howl, and nothing howls back. You think of Benjamin, the one in the zoo. There's an old rumor, unverified, likely exaggerated, that after he died, someone came to collect the body and found it had vanished. Slipped away. Vanished like smoke. Untrue, most likely. But appealing. The idea that the last one wasn't caged. That maybe he left. That maybe he's still out here. Somewhere. You rise, brush off your pants, and keep walking. The air shifts. Subtly at first cooler, thinner, like the forest exhaled and forgot to breathe back in. You emerge into a clearing, unnaturally square, as if nature paused here for someone else's convenience. The grass is patchy. The stones are too neat. And the silence. The silence is wrong. You're standing in a zoo, or what's left of one. The remnants of the Hobart Zoo, formerly the Beaumaris Zoo, aren't here, not in this forest, but they follow you like an echo. Because this is where the story narrows to one, a single creature caged, recorded, and forgotten under fluorescent lights. Benjamin. Though, of course, that wasn't his name. No one even confirmed his sex until it was too late. For years he was referred to as a he, though photographs show no evidence. Historians still debate whether Benjamin was male or female, but it hardly matters. The story's heartbreak doesn't change. You close your eyes. You can see the cage, concrete floor, wire mesh, no shelter, a few wooden beams to give the illusion of habitat. There's a short, flickering film, perhaps the most famous moving image of extinction itself, showing Benjamin pacing, back and forth, tail dragging, head low. He yawns once, revealing that eerie, too-wide gape, then settles into a corner like someone trying to disappear in plain sight. The footage is grainy, soundless, but somehow louder than anything else. It's a strange thing watching a species vanish in 30 seconds of black and white film. You shift your weight and glance toward a large rock outcropping. You imagine Benjamin asleep there, curled like a cat, the wind pushing through mesh, too open to block the cold. On September 7th, 1936, the zoo staff forgot or failed to bring him inside during a frost. He died of exposure, alone, without fanfare. His death wasn't even noted until months later. You whisper his name now. Not because he'll hear it, but because someone should say it kindly. The official extinction date came decades later, 1986, when the IUCN finally gave up. But the truth is, Benjamin was likely the last. The full stop at the end of a quiet sentence. You kneel, brushing moss from a small stone that feels like it belongs to this memory. It's not a grave, just a marker. But in your mind, this is where he rests. You wonder what he thought of humans. Not in the philosophical sense, just, did he recognize us? Did he wait for someone to come back? Someone who never did. The zoo itself was modest, originally built for imported animals, not native ones. The thylacine wasn't exotic enough for fame, but strange enough to draw stares. It paced behind glass, watched by visitors who didn't understand what they were losing. There's a letter somewhere tucked in an archive where a zookeeper complains about the smelly dog thing in the back enclosure. That thing was Benjamin, the last of his kind. You walk around the imaginary perimeter of the cage. It wasn't large. The footage makes it seem expansive, but it was barely bigger than a living room. And that yawn so famous now wasn't a roar. It was fatigue, discomfort, resignation. He didn't perform, he paced. You remember that modern zoos now replicate ecosystems, natural lighting, enrichment activities, soft bedding. But Benjamin had none of that. He had wire floors and concrete and spectators with flash cameras. Still, he outlived the expectations. Captured in 1933, likely as a juvenile, he lived 3 years longer than many thylacines did in captivity. They were notoriously difficult to keep stressed, easily prone to pacing refused food. Some died within days. You wonder if Benjamin knew he was alone, or if he thought he'd simply been misplaced. That his pack would return, that the forest would open and someone would call him back. You exhale and sit on the ground. The birds here are louder now, chirping as if to fill in the silence Benjamin left behind. A kookaburra cackles in the distance, an inappropriate laugh, but strangely fitting. You pull out your notebook again and sketch the cage. You don't draw Benjamin this time. You leave the enclosure empty, not out of grief, but out of hope. Because here's the strange truth. Even in captivity, even in death, Benjamin became something more. A symbol, a warning, a question. And maybe in some deeply stubborn way, a spark. Because after him, something changed. The world began to care. Not soon enough, not nearly, but it began. You stand, brush the dust off your hands, and turn toward the trail. One step, then another, as if you're walking out of the cage, too. The trail feels quieter now. Not in the way of silence, but in the way of reverence. Like the forest has registered what you've seen, what you've remembered, and has decided to speak more softly in return. You walk with slower steps, more careful. Not out of fear, but as if not to wake something sacred. Something that might still be sleeping just behind the next tree. You think about the sound that defined the thylacine, its call, or lack of one. Unlike wolves or coyotes, it didn't howl into the night with power or drama. It didn't roar like the big cats it was named after. No, the thylacine sound was almost embarrassing in its modesty. A dry cough, a husky yip, an exhale with ambition, like someone trying to start a sentence and forgetting what they were saying halfway through. Yet even that soft noise had power, because it belonged to something now lost. And things we lose always echo louder in our memories. One of the earliest recordings of the thylacine sound doesn't exist. Let that sink in. All we have are written descriptions, people scrawling phrases like a faint barking, a whistling hiss, or a yawning sigh. Each one sounds less like a predator and more like someone's grandpa waking from a nap. And yet some part of you wants to hear it for yourself. You sit on a fallen tree that creaks just a little under your weight. Birds call, wind lifts, leaves rustle. And for a heartbeat, just one, you imagine it. That soft bark, that strangled wheeze of presence. It wouldn't make a dog whimper, but it might make the hairs on your neck rise. In 1935, just a year before Benjamin's death, a zookeeper described hearing a sound like a weak trumpet played through cotton. He wasn't sure it came from the thylacine, but no one else in the zoo claimed it either. Historians still argue whether the thylacine vocalized at all in captivity or if it gave up trying. You touch your throat unconsciously, wondering what it means to have a voice and not use it, or to use it and go unheard. The thing is, nobody really studied the thylacine when it mattered. There were no long-term field observations, no sound recordings, no behavioral logs. It was hunted before it was understood, captured before it was respected, preserved only after it had nothing left to say. You think about sound as memory, about the howl of wolves that still echo across mountain valleys, the territorial roars of lions under an African moon, the mournful song of whales bouncing through cold, dark oceans. And then the thylacine, whispering perhaps, or not, we'll never know. You rise slow and deliberate and follow the path as it snakes down into a shallow gully. Here the forest thickens again, fern-fringed and dripping from last night's dew. Every footstep squishes faintly like the land itself is making room for you. In this hollow, you imagine a den, not a dramatic cave or cliffside, but a shallow burrow under a log. Dry leaves tucked around the entrance, cub-sized scratch marks inside. A soft rustle of movement, not menacing, just alive. The thylacine didn't howl to terrify. It called to connect, to mark presence, to say, I'm here. And now, nothing says that anymore. Well, almost nothing, because here you are, saying it for them. You reach a stone outcrop and climb. It's not high, but enough to give you a view. Trees sway gently. A shadow flickers across a distant ridge. Your heart jumps, then settles. just a wallaby flicking its ears at nothing. But for a moment, brief and beautiful, you imagined stripes. And that matters. Because when something is truly gone, you don't see it anymore. Even in the corners. Even in dreams. It fades. The thylacine hasn't faded. It lingers. Not in sound, but in silence that remembers. You take one last look over the ridgeline, then descend again, quiet as breath. You begin to notice something strange in the forest, the absence of surprise. Not just silence, but a kind of emotional stillness. As if everything has already happened. As if the forest is rehearsing the same scene over and over, and you're just another actor joining late in the play. You step carefully through tall bracken, ducking beneath the arch of a fallen limb, and feel the weight of this repetition, how extinction isn't dramatic, but gradual. Bureaucratic even. And that's what brings you to the paperwork. You imagine a desk in a cold government office. A man in a stiff shirt thumbing through forms with thylacine in the margins. Somewhere between minor nuisance and not our department. The thing is, the last of a species doesn't usually go out in a blaze. It gets filed, forgotten, misplaced in a drawer under budget proposals and fence permits. And that's exactly what happened. You come upon an old ranger station, collapsed walls, a rusted hinge barely clinging to the shadow of a door. Inside, long buried under vines and rot, might be reports, sightings, appeals, none of which were answered in time. You picture the moment someone really realized, that Benjamin had died and no others remained. Not in a remote corner of Tasmania. Not in a private enclosure. Not in a traveling menagerie. Gone. And still no public statement. No national day of mourning. The government didn't formally protect the species until after it was extinct. In 1936, just 2 months before Benjamin's death, the Tasmanian government finally passed legislation to protect the thylacine. 2 months. It's the kind of timing you'd expect in a dark comedy if it weren't so achingly real. Historians still debate whether this delay was pure negligence or a calculated shrug. Some claim the animal was already considered functionally extinct. Others argue it was simply low on the political priority list, somewhere beneath road maintenance and rabbit control. Either way, the effect was the same. Too late. You look up as a wattle bird bursts from a low branch. Its call cuts through the stillness, a sharp, almost metallic croak, and then it's gone. You envy that clarity, that confidence, that ability to announce one's presence and vanish without apology. The thylacine never had that luxury. Its extinction wasn't witnessed with reverence, it was observed with inconvenience. You crouch by a patch of flattened earth where kangaroo grass has been pressed into a hollow, possibly a bed for a wallaby, possibly just the result of wind. But in your mind you see a striped back, curling there, nose tucked into flank tail, flicking once before sleep. You feel that old ache, the one that's half sadness, half useless rage. The zoo officials didn't keep his body. They didn't preserve his remains. No skeleton, no tissue samples. Nothing that could help scientists later. Only a few stiff photos and a 30-second film loop. You stand and continue on. You reach a small creek. A rickety footbridge spans it, rotting planks green with moss. You test one with your boot. It groans but holds. Halfway across, you stop and look down into the water. Clear, cold, moving slowly. You see your reflection. And beside it, for a moment, a second face. Slender, elongated, a wide snout, striped, watching you with those unreadable thylacine eyes. But it's only the warping of light, a ripple, a trick. Still, you linger. Because sometimes paperwork isn't the end of the story. In 1982, the thylacine was declared extinct by international conservation bodies. And yet sightings continued. Reports, blurry photographs, shaky camcorder clips, Hikers, farmers, postal workers, all claiming they saw it, or thought they did. You smile faintly. Because hope is not paperwork. Hope doesn't need a government seal or a deadline. Hope slips between the pages and waits. You cross the bridge and disappear again to the trees. Behind you, the creek whispers. And somewhere a very old file cabinet creaks open in your imagination. You didn't expect Tasmania to feel this endless. But here, deep in the folds of its ancient bushland, the world seems to stretch, like time itself got snagged on the branches and decided to stay a while. You brush past a wall of fern fronds and step into another hush, the kind of quiet that only exists where very old things once were. This is the land that still whispers. And you begin to notice how often those whispers sound like stripes. Because here in this exact kind of forest, winding, remote, mostly unchanged, since before motorcars and mugshots, the thylacine may still linger. May. It's the word that keeps people returning. The stories are always the same and always different. A camper hears something unusual, a cough, a growl, something between breath and bark. A bushwalker spots a shape slipping between trees. A driver swears they saw a striped back leaping across the road at dusk, too big to be a cat, too sleek to be a dog. You pause beside a tree whose trunk splits in two like a gate. The space between is just wide enough for a creature to pass through without brushing either side. You imagine it. Low body, long tail, forward-facing eyes catching a glint of your campfire before vanishing. In 1982, 2 park rangers in Tasmania's far southwest claimed they saw one. They described its movement, smooth, deliberate tail, stiff like a stick dragging behind. It didn't run. It turned. Looked, held eye contact for a breath, then vanished into scrub so thick they couldn't follow. Their report was detailed, immediate, and sincere. Still no proof. Historians, zoologists, amateur sleuths. Everyone still argues whether it was a thylacine or a misidentified fox or a shared hallucination brought on by long shifts and wishful thinking. But their voices trembled when they told the story. And that means something. You take a seat on a flat boulder warmed faintly by the midday sun. The breeze moves through trees in slow waves, making the leaves murmur like a restless crowd. You could almost believe they're saying, yes, yes, we saw it too. There's a whole subculture around thylacine sightings now. Blogs, forums, documentaries with haunting piano scores. Conspiracy theories, even claims that the government is hiding surviving populations, or that the last thylacine was smuggled overseas, or that a secret breeding program lives underground somewhere in central Tasmania. You smile. Not at the absurdity, but at the hope. Even false hope is better than silence. And sometimes it's not entirely false. Because the island does keep secrets. Tasmania has terrain humans still haven't fully mapped. Places only reachable by foot through days of dense rainforest, valleys that hide their own weather, mountains that reflect sound oddly, regions where even GPS signals vanish like the land itself has chosen privacy. If any place could harbor a ghost, it would be here. You think of the camera traps? Placed across reserves and remote corridors blinking in the night, waiting for proof. Every so often, one triggers capturing a wallaby, a quoll, a devil, a possum, and sometimes something else. A blurry figure, striped, four-legged, too tall to be a cat, too long to be a dog, but never clear enough to be sure. You've seen the footage. You've paused it, enhanced it, tilted your head at just the right angle. Still, maybe. In 2016, a truck driver reported seeing 2 thylacines crossing the road late at night. He described them in detail, down to the stiff tails and the peculiar way they moved. His story made national news. Experts shrugged. Locals nodded quietly. And the forest remained unchanged. You rise from the boulder and step into a darker part of the trail where the canopy thickens and the light filters down in golden shafts. the kind of light that hides as much as it reveals. You imagine walking just 10 paces more and hearing it, the cough, the huff, the impossible sound. You imagine turning and seeing eyes reflecting back, not hostile, not afraid, just watching. You don't expect it, but you allow it, because this is where things hide. Not because they're extinct, but because they've learned the cost of being seen. You blink longer now when you pause, not out of exhaustion, though the miles are adding up, but because the forest feels different when your eyes are almost closed. You begin to sense things more by shape than by certainty. The way a branch curves might be a tail. The pattern of bark might be stripes. It's a kind of hopeful misreading, and you welcome it. Because here in the half-blink space between reality and imagination, something else has started to emerge. Science, or at least science in its more feverish form, resurrection. You descend toward a dry creek bed, boots crunching over pebbles and bones, probably wallaby, possibly ancient. And as you walk, you picture not trees but test tubes, not ferns but freezers. It's the age of DNA, and some people aren't ready to let go. You've read about the efforts, of course. Headlines whispered breathlessly. Scientists plan to bring back the Tasmanian tiger. Always using tiger because it sells better than marsupial, with stiff tail and a social anxiety disorder. In laboratories across the world, from Melbourne to Melbourne, Massachusetts, researchers have combed through old pelts, bones, and pickled joeys, extracting strands of DNA like archaeologists, brushing dust off a forgotten name. The dream is simple. Build a thylacine from the ground up. Stitch its genetic ghost into the nucleus of a related species, maybe the Tasmanian devil, maybe the numbat, and coax it into being through cloning. You pause at the edge of the creek, run your fingers through the gritty dust, and wonder, would it really be the same? Or just a thylacine-shaped impersonation stitched with ambition and awe? Historians still argue whether de-extinction is preservation or performance, whether it honors the animal or just soothes our guilt. Some say we should, others say we mustn't, because the animal wouldn't just need a body. It would need a home, a world that no longer exists. Forests now fragmented, prey now scarcer, a social structure it may not remember, instincts that no longer align with reality. You look up at the surrounding trees, green, full, beautiful, and still not quite the same as they were a century ago. Noise pollution, disease, climate shifts, introduce species. If we bring the thylacine back, would we only be resurrecting it to watch it die again? You sigh and sit on a smooth rock in the creek bed, tracing circles with a stick in the dust. A part of you wants to believe the scientists, to imagine a young thylacine squirming in an artificial womb, blinking at a world it doesn't understand, raised by humans who cheer at its breath, but can't teach it how to hunt, or hide, or howl. One team in 2022 claimed they could do it within a decade. Another team disagreed, and the forest said nothing. You stand again, follow a winding path that leads through denser trees, twisted gums, and blackwoods, casting long shadows that bend toward you like questions. This part of the forest feels untouched, primal, less like a trail, more like a dream. You let yourself imagine it. A thylacine steps into the path, not a ghost, not a hologram, not a flickering photo on a presentation slide, but flesh and fur. Alive, it looks at you, tilts its head slightly, blinks. And in that blink is the entire history of extinction and everything we never learned from it. Then it turns, quiet, deliberate, and walks back into the green. You don't follow? Because you know now that to see it again's not the point. To deserve it again, that's the work. The forest sways. And somewhere deep in a freezer beneath a fluorescent lab, a tiny thread of DNA waits. You find yourself walking slower now, not because the terrain has changed, but because the weight of the story is heavier than your pack. You trail a path lined with peppermint gums, their leaves, exhaling that strange, cool scent like menthol and memory. The forest here feels clean and raw, like it hasn't been touched by anything louder than a possum's paw in 100 years. A good place for a predator to be forgotten, or maybe remembered. But not all predators are feared. You start to wonder how much of the thylacine's legacy was shaped by its teeth, and how much by our imagination, because fear isn't rational, it's curated. You reach a small plateau where burnt trees rise like cathedral columns, black and silver, their bark still flaking from some long-ago fire. The undergrowth has returned soft green shrubs pushing through ash and shadow. You crouch by a tree and draw a line in the soot with your finger. You think about how fear shifted over time. Once it was the thylacine that haunted settlers. Too quiet, too alien, too hard to pin down. The stripes unsettled people, not because they were dangerous, but because they were unfamiliar. But after Benjamin's death, the narrative flipped. It didn't take long before children were taught to mourn it instead of fear it. The villain became a victim. The monster became a martyr. The same headlines that once cried, "Menace to livestock," now whispered, "Tragedy of the lost tiger." Funny how grief wears stripes, too. You stand again, letting the wind push through your sleeves. It carries the faint sound of traffic in the far distance, muffled strange like civilization, trying to remember where it put its remorse. In the absence of the thylacine, we invented new monsters, invasive species, algorithms, diseases, scandals. Things to blame, things to chase. Because it's easier to fight something with a headline than sit with the silence you caused. You reach a rusted sign half swallowed by a tree trunk. Conservation zone. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Uppa. You smile because the irony is too rich. The land once filled with traps and guns is now off limits in the name of protection. But protection for what? You think about the animals still here, devils, betongs, quolls. All endangered, all at risk of becoming footnotes. You picture a wallaby nervously grazing, a devil with cancerous sores, a quoll blinking up from its burrow like a question. These are the heirs to the thylacine's ghost, and yet they walk the same line, teetering between obscurity and absence. Modern conservation tries to do better. There are breeding programs, sanctuaries, rewilding efforts, but it's hard, expensive, politicized, and often too late. Still, you can't help but wonder, what if the thylacine had been cuter, or more cooperative, or just luckier? Would we have tried harder? Would we have saved it? Historians still argue whether the thylacine could have been preserved had the warnings been taken seriously just 5 years earlier. Or 3, or even 1. But extinction doesn't negotiate, and nature doesn't keep receipts. You walk on the sky, darkening slightly overhead, as clouds roll in like old thoughts. You unzip your jacket just enough to feel the air. It smells like rain and distant regrets. You pause on a rise and glance behind you. Nothing there, but you imagine anyway a figure watching you from the brush. Just for a moment. Golden eyes, stiff tail, shoulders striped like the edge of memory. Not hunting you, just wondering why it took you so long to come looking. The trail bends toward the coast now. You can smell its salt and something older, like wet stone and time. The trees begin to thin as wind presses through, shaping the canopy with invisible hands. Each gust feels like a breath blown through the lungs of the earth itself. You rest a hand on a smooth boulder, warm despite the clouds. The lichen blooms across it in patches that almost look like stripes. You chuckle. You're seeing them everywhere now. But maybe that's not madness. Maybe that's what remembering looks like. You came here chasing a myth, but what you've gathered are lessons, not loud ones. Not the kind you write in textbooks or carve into museum plaques. just quiet truths gathered like stones in your pocket. The thylacine didn't die in a single moment. It unraveled, and no one noticed until the thread was gone. You think of all the species teetering now, creatures on the edge, blinking back at us from behind disappearing trees, melting ice, collapsing reefs. Most won't get a Benjamin. Most won't be filmed pacing one last time. Most will just fade, and we'll look up one day and realize the silence sounds different. You sit beneath a twisted coastal tea tree, its branches arching like ribs above your head. You've heard stories of this very area where locals claimed decades ago to have seen a striped shape sprint across the dunes. Fast, low to the ground tail, straight as a plank. One man said it looked right at him before vanishing into the bush. Of course, he didn't have a camera. He just had a story. Some dismissed it. Others leaned in closer, asked him to repeat the way the tail moved, the way the body turned. There's a hunger in us for certainty, yes, but also for mystery. You realize now the thylacine was never just an animal. It was a mirror. It showed us what we ignored, what we feared, what we failed to protect, and maybe, just maybe, what we still could. You take a breath and let it out slowly, counting each exhale like the forest might be listening. The wind answers, not in words, but in rhythm. You think again of those last moments in the zoo. Benjamin curled in the cold. No caretaker came, no blanket, no witness. But now you are the witness. You walking the trails it once padded, breathing the air it once sliced through with careful strides, listening for a sound you know won't come, and still hoping. The lesson isn't about punishment, it's about attention. Extinction doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just stops knocking. You stand legs, stiff bones popping in quiet protest. You look toward the edge of the trees where the land falls toward the sea. The waves crash distantly, pulling at the edges of the island like they want to take the memory with them. But the stripes remain. Not in fur, maybe, but in thought, in artwork, in bedtime stories, in documentaries, in failed cloning experiments, in blurry photos and hopeful forums, in jokes whispered on long hikes, in you. You walk forward again, slower now, almost afraid to disturb the wind. Each step presses gently into soft earth, not to leave a mark, but to listen. You reach the last stretch of trail just as the light begins to tip into gold. That low, late afternoon sun drips through the branches in long fingers, touching everything with the soft sadness of endings. You walk in its glow, your shadow stretched, and strange behind you, thin legs, long arms, the silhouette of a seeker rather than a speaker. Here the trees lean slightly pulled by decades of wind toward the ocean. The sound of surf begins to layer into the air, steady, relentless, like time itself tumbling over the same shoreline again and again, pretending each wave is new. You follow a row of weather-beaten stakes, perhaps once a boundary, now just fence posts for ghosts. One has snapped completely, its splinters chewed by salt and age. You pause beside it. And there in the dirt beneath a thorny bush, something catches your eye. You kneel. A print. No, just a trick of shadow. The curve of a leaf, the dip of a hoof print. The hopeful geometry of the mind rearranging soil into memory. Still, you stare a while longer than you mean to. Because even if it isn't real, what you feel is, and sometimes that's what matters most. You continue along a small bluff, where the hill falls away to a wide view of the sea. Kelp floats in looping trails near the shoreline. Gulls wheel above the foam. And for a moment, the wind shifts in such a way that you imagine the whisper of a howl, not loud, not dramatic, just a breath with intent. You close your eyes and hold it in your chest. You think of the mothers, the thylacine females curling around their joeys in hollow logs, licking them clean, teaching them when to move and when to still. You think of the fathers, maybe with pouches too, guarding the rear of a slow, silent march, through underbrush, always listening. You think of the cubs, striped from the start, born too small to survive on their own, crawling blindly toward a warm pouch they'd never see but always trust. They lived like whispers. They vanished like smoke, and yet they're still here, in old skins folded in drawers, in notebooks, margins scrawled with uncertain sketches, in shaky memories passed from hiker to hiker like matches in the dark. In your footsteps, pressed softly now into the sand as you take the final path down to the beach. The waves greet you, not kindly, not cruelly, just honestly. They've seen too much to be impressed by extinction, but still they let you near. You remove your boots. Walk barefoot? Feel the cool press of wet sand and seaweed between your toes. You step until the water laps at your ankles, then stop. The horizon yawns open, endless. You whisper, "I'm sorry." Then softer, "Thank you." And then you're still. Just the sea, the sky, and the hush. The hush of what was. The hush of what might be again. Because even now people listen. Even now the thylacine howls not in sound, but in silence that demands we stay awake, that we pay attention, that we learn. You turn back toward the trees one last time. The forest says nothing, but something in it watches, waits, remembers. You lie down now, somewhere quiet, somewhere far from cities and closer to the rhythm of tide and wind. Let your head rest in the crook of your arm. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts uncoil like vines touched by rain. You don't need to search anymore. You've walked the forests, sat in the shadows, listened for sounds that no longer come, and found, instead, the shape of stillness. That's where the thylacine lives now, not in zoos, not in science labs, not even in the photographs pinned to museum walls, but in that hush, that pause, that awareness that every footstep matters. Breathe in slowly. Let it fill your lungs like cool mist. Breathe out. Let go of guilt. Let go of noise. Let go. Tonight the trees will keep watch. The wind will carry the memories. And somewhere in a dream not far from here, a striped shadow may pass quietly behind you, unafraid, unbothered, simply moving forward. Like it always did. You are safe now. You are still. The story is told. The forest is quiet. And the thylacine sleeps. Good night.